Hello, sweet friends, and welcome back to the Quilter's Candy Shop, where you will find sweet treats for the discerning quilter. Today, we're going to be doing a Scrap Busters 2025 challenge video. In January, I suggested we get to work on all those scraps that are piling up, and today we're going to use some of the triangle trimmings from our house party quilt from a couple of weeks ago. In our house party video, we turned a lovely 10-inch square pack into a flock of flying geese and a whole neighborhood of birdhouses. Along the way, we created a pile of triangle trimmings from building our flying geese. Even if you didn't join in making the house party quilt, I'm sure you have a stash of triangle trimmings or other scraps that you would like to use up and move out of your scrap bag. When I am sewing stitch and flip half square triangles, or I'm building a flying geese unit using the stitch and flip method, I always save what I call the quilt litter. This is the part that gets trimmed off, and most patterns tell you to throw this away. But if you just stitch that unit together and press it open, it's like getting a free half square triangle. I mean, it's not garbage. It may be litter, but it's still valuable. I keep a little bucket next to my machine, and as I trim my stitch and flip pieces, I save all my quilt litter. I either use them as thread savers as I work on my quilt, or at the end of my project, I run them through the machine in a big long chain so I have them ready to sew together when I decide to make a scrap quilt. Today we are going to make one of my quilt litter scrap quilts called Flitter and Flutter. I love this simple scrap quilt because it uses a lot of quilt litter. Let's get started. Do you remember these? These are all the triangle trimmings of the flying geese from the house party quilt. This quilt has 42 blocks with 4 flying geese in each and 2 stitch and flip triangles for the geese, which means I have about 336 bits of quilt litter here. You will also need a goodly amount of background fabric. You can make it match, or you can use up a bunch of low volume scraps. Most of my quilt litter is from the same project, so I'm going to use the country confetti that will match the background of my blocks. Either way, it's going to look great. Here is the progression of the Flitter and Flutter block. Now, this right here is the part that gets trimmed off of whatever you are making. A half square triangle, a flying geese, or a snowball, or for whatever you are using the stitch and flip method. This is the litter. I call this piece a litter bit. So if you are following one of my litter scrap patterns, when it says collect 336 litter bits, this is what you want to pull from your scraps. Litter bits get sewn together on the long side in order to turn it into a square. The square is pressed and trimmed to a standard size, so it's ready to be used in a pattern. Once a litter bit has been pressed and trimmed, I call it a litter square. It helps to distinguish between the pieces that have not been processed or trimmed and those that are ready to go in a block. So when the pattern says use 2 litter squares to make a 4 patch, you will know which pieces to collect. Once the litter squares are sewn into a 4 patch, it is called a flitter block. This is one of the common blocks used in the flitter scrap patterns, so it has its own name, flitter block. This is a litter bit, this is a litter square, this is a flitter block. It's a 4 patch with the litter bits in it. And then this is the flutter block. And then this is the block we're going to be using for this quilt. Since we are working with quilt litter, the first thing we have to do is run all of our triangle pairs through the machine, if you haven't already, and get them sewn along the long side or the hypotenuse of the triangles to turn them into squares. Then press them open with the seam allowances to one side. For this block, your litter bits need to have a color on one side and a background on the other. If you have a litter bit that has color on both sides, you can either save it for later or you can take it apart and add a background. I'm just going to sew these down both sides, and I'll be able to press them and trim them up, and I'll have 2 more litter squares. Once your litter bits are pressed, it's time to determine what size your litter squares will be. I take a small handful, maybe 5 or 6 squares, and I'm going to trim them up to see what size I can get all of my squares to be. Then I take the smallest one and I retrim all the rest of them so they're all the same size. And then I'll continue trimming all of the rest of the litter bits into the same size litter squares. It looks like mine are going to be 1 3/4 inches big. Yours may be different, and that's okay. Just make them all the same. Once we get all of our litter bits turned into trimmed litter squares, we'll come right back and go on to the next step. Whew, that was a lot of trimming. 336 litter bits pressed, trimmed, and turned into 336 litter squares. Now that we have all of these darling litter squares, we have to turn them into FLlTTER 4 patches. Whether you are using a single background or a variety of scraps, you need a square of background the same size as your litter square. In fact, you need an equal number of background squares as you have litter squares. To figure out how many strips to cut, you have to do a little bit of math. You need the number of squares times the size of your squares, and that number is the total number of running inches that you need. So in my case, I have 1 3/4 inches times 336 equals 588 running inches. Now you have to take that number and divide it by the width of your fabric. So my 588 running inches divided by 42 will equal 14 strips that I need to cut to get enough background to make my FLlTTER 4 patches. In order to know how much fabric you need for that, you just take 14, which is the number of strips, and multiply that by the width of your square. So again, my squares are 1 3/4 inches. So you multiply 1 3/4 times 14, and that equals 24.5 inches I need just to complete my FLlTTER blocks. I hope that made sense. I'll put the mathematical equation down in the description so you can follow it more easily. I'm going to turn these litter squares into FLlTTER squares. That's going to take a little while, so let's get to it. Once you have enough background pieces, we are going to chain piece all of the litter squares to a background square. You have to be careful about which side you put the square on. You want to make sure you put it to a side of the triangle and not a side of the background. I like to start with a corner that doesn't have a point on it, thereby reducing the chance that the corner is going to get shoved down into the stitch plate. I also prefer to stitch with the background piece on the bottom. That way, when you come across this seam, it's on top where you can manage it so it doesn't get flipped. However you want to sew them is fine. Just remember they must all be sewn in the same registration. All the angles have to be the same in your chain stitching. You're going to press your seam allowances towards the background square. I know that seems backwards. Usually you press towards the dark, but in this case, because of the seam allowance, we are going to press towards the background square. And then when this is turned around, right here, your intersection will nest. Now here's the fun part. You can match up your litter squares for the 4 patch, or You can mix them up and make them more scrappy. That's up to you. For this quilt, because of the sweet prints, I'm going to match mine, but you can do it however you like. You can mix them, you can match them, or you can do half and half. Mix and match. Once you have all of your litter squares sewn with a background square and pressed with the seam allowance towards the background, match up 2 pieces and sew the litter square pairs together. Lastly, you're going to spin the seam allowances to reduce the bulk in the center. When I'm done with all of these, I should have 168 Flitter 4-patch blocks. Let's go. Alrighty, and here we have all of our Flitter 4-patch blocks. The next step is to turn these cute little 4 patches into the Flutter block, and for that we are going to need more background. Again, you can choose whether you want to use the same background as in your little blocks, or if you want to mix and match some other scrap backgrounds or yardage. That's completely up to you. The Flutter block is super easy to make. First, you need a Flitter 4-patch block, and then you need a square that is equal size. Next, measure the sewn unit and add a rectangle of equal size. So now you can see, no matter what size litter bits you are working with, all the following steps are dependent upon what size you make your Flitter 4-patch blocks. Depending on how big you are making your blocks and your quilt top, cut equal numbers of strips with the fabric for your squares and for your rectangles. Then cross-cut them to the sizes you need. You need 1 square and 1 rectangle for every Flitter block. Now that we have all of our background rectangles and squares cut, we're going to assemble the Flutter block. And as I said before, you're going to start with a Flitter 4-patch block, and you're going to add a background square to the side. Now, it doesn't matter what side you add the background square to, it really just doesn't matter. However, once you decide on how you want to put it together, all the blocks need to be made in the same way. So, sew your Flitter 4-patch block with your background square, right sides together with a scant 1/4 inch seam. Once you have your pair set made, we're going to add the rectangle to the side. And again, it doesn't matter if you put it on this side or if you put it on this side. You just have to be consistent and make all your blocks come out the exact same way. Right sides together and a 1/4 inch seam along this line. And here you go. Here's the Flutter block. All the seam allowances get pressed towards the background. Once you get all of your blocks made, all 168 of them, come back and we will show you the layout. On a side note, if you go ahead and chain piece the background square to your Flitter 4-patch block, it makes it easier to keep the registration of your pieces all facing the same direction. You can do the same thing when adding the rectangle to the unit. Make these chains in manageable quantities like 8, 10, 12 pieces to keep the piecing and the pressing simple and efficient. Okay, here we go. I have got all of my Flitter blocks turned into Flutter blocks. If you're using my same measurements, your block should measure 5.5 inches square with the Flitter 4-patch block in the corner. Now, you will want to count your blocks, make sure you have enough for whatever layout you are going to do. If you started with the same amount that I had, which was 336 litter bits, then you should have 168 Flutter blocks. That means you'll be able to make a 12 by 14 layout. The fastest and easiest way to do your layout is to just put the blocks all the same registration, one right after another. And when you get multiple rows together, they are going to look a lot more scattered than they do in just a couple rows. But if the rows are a little too in alignment for you, the second easiest layout is to adjust this row by half. And all you need to do is cut a few extra of this rectangle that you used on the side of your block and add it to every other row on the left side and then the opposite row on the right side. And that just sets it off by 1/2 of a block, and it gives it a little bit more of an offset, and it looks really pretty. The other nice thing about this layout is because all of your vertical seams are pressed toward the background rectangle, all of your seams will nest. In the first layout, to get your seams to nest, you will need to press your vertical seams in the odd number rows to the left and the even number rows to the right. Another way you can lay out your blocks is the 90-degree method. Using the rectangle as the registration marker, I'm going to put the rectangle of the flutter block to the top and then turn it 90 degrees and put the rectangle to the left. And repeat, top, left, all the way across the top row. Then for the second row, we'll place the rectangle on the bottom and then the right, bottom right, all the way across the second row. You'll repeat that pattern all the way down. I think this pattern is adorable because soon you will see these little butterfly pairs glittering and fluttering all over your quilt top. This is probably the layout I'm going to use, but you do whatever you want. You can even come up with a pattern of your own, including randomly twisting and turning the blocks until you come up with a design that makes you happy. Keep in mind that some of your intersections may or may not nest. And as always, you will start by sewing all your blocks together into rows, and then sew all your rows together to complete the inside of your quilt top. With that, I'm going to start sewing all my blocks together, and I will see you on the other side. I'm popping back on to show you my progress. I started by sewing 2 rows together, and then I made 7 pairs of 2 rows. Once I got that done, I put the 2 pairs together, making a row of 4. And I did that 3 times, which left a single pair row at the end. Now I just have to finish sewing all my rows together, and the inside of my quilt top will be done. And here it is. I just love the way this scrappy quilt turned out. I know it doesn't look that scrappy because I chose to use all the same background fabric, but you certainly could use a lot of different backgrounds with a variety of values, and that would turn out lovely. To finish the top, I added a 2.5-inch wide floating border to preserve the points in my blocks and to secure the edges of the quilt top. My finished Flitter and Flutter quilt measures 64 inches by 74 inches, which is a nice size throw. I can just imagine that this will be perfect on the front porch, or laid on a settee in a sunroom, or draped across a couch in a cute country cottage. I was a little skeptical at first when I saw my pieces coming together. I was worried because some of the pieces themselves were so light, but in the end it gave it depth, as if some of the butterflies were close and some were far away. It's a pastel kaleidoscope of flittering and fluttering butterfly scraps. That's it. I can't wait to send it to my quilter. I hope you enjoyed learning how to make the Flitter and Flutter quilt. If you did, please give us a thumbs up and leave us a cute butterfly emoji in the comments. We would really appreciate it. If you'd like to be notified the next time we do a fun project like this, smash the subscribe button. And don't forget to stop by the shop at www.thequilterscandyshop.com. That's SHOPPE shop.com to grab some background fabric to help you finish your scrappy Flitter and Flutter quilt. Thanks for watching. Now, go sew something sweet. Bye!